This was today's lesson, or if you were watching afterwards, Monday, the 25th of April. This is a lesson that we had to rush through in 4th hour and didn't get to it all in 6th hour, so hopefully you all get a chance to look at this and hopefully refresh and reinforce your knowledge about monetary policy. So we're going to be looking at how the Fed uses it and also how their monetary policy and impact on the monetary money supply in graphs will transfer into an impact on aggregate demand. So first up, a quick review of the different types of monetary policy tools. The Fed can either act in an expansionary or contractionary way. And of course, keep in mind, this is through them interacting with the money supply. They can either have the impact of increasing the money supply and decreasing interest rates, or they can have the impact of decreasing the money supply and increasing interest rates. And so if they are, for example, in a recession, they would want expansionary money policy, which we also call easy money policy, since the money is now easier to get to. And so our three tools are the reserve requirement, open market operations, and discount rate. And so reserve requirement, if we want an easy money policy and we want more of it out there, we want banks to hold on to less. So we would want the reserve requirement to decrease. Likewise, we would want the discount rate to also decrease. Because if the discount rate is lower, then what you can have is that banks are more willing to borrow from each other and from the Fed, which will then increase the amount of money. The third one, the most used one, is open market operations. And the best way for the Fed to get money out there is by putting money in the hands of people by buying bonds. So that's their big open market operation type here. On the other side, if there's inflation, which is the Fed's worst nightmare, it keeps them up at night, they hate it, they could do the opposite of the other hand. On the other hand, they could increase the reserve requirement, so make it so that banks now have to hold on to more money. Likewise, with the discount rate, they could increase that as well. And so if they increase the discount rate, what you've got in that case is that they'll be less likely to borrow from other banks or from the Fed. And in this case, what is happening is they will have less money to lend out. Or, the most common one through open market operations, they could sell bonds. And if they decide to sell bonds, what they're doing is taking money out of the hands of people. They're holding on to it. When the Fed holds on to it, they're completely removing it from the money supply. It is no longer an M1 or M2. And what these people are left with is just a sheet of paper saying, hey, you can use this at a specific period of time in the future to get a certain amount of interest on top of it in the future. As we covered before, the Fed usually uses open market operations. It barely ever touches the discount rate. And it does not like to touch the reserve rate. The reserve rate has not changed since 1980, and the discount rate that the Fed controls has changed 0.25% in 5 years. In December of 2015, they decided they would alter it by 0.25%. But before that, it hadn't changed since early 2009. So they use open market operations, buying and selling bonds. And what they do is they can't specifically say this is going to be our interest rate. What they do is they interest rate target. And so what they do is say they want their federal funds rate, so the rate at which banks can trade with each other. What they did most recently, they set a range between 0 to 0.5%. And so what they did then is they increased the money supply until it pushed it down. So they increased the money supply until they could push down the interest rate to where they wanted it to go, and they tried to keep it down there. And so they can't force banks to trade at the interest rate they want to. All they can do is target that interest rate through their open market operations in that case. So if they aren't trading yet where they want to, they can either buy a little bit more or sell a little bit more. And the way the Fed did this was something they called quantitative easing. Now, of course, buying and selling bonds, the impact that it would have if we are at, let's say we are at the money supply 2, so SM2 here, in which there is $150 billion demanded and $150 billion supplied. This puts us at a real interest rate of 8%. If the Fed wants to have an expansionary fiscal policy, if they want to have a positive impact on the economy, they might say we're going to increase our money supply by $25 billion. And what that would do on our demand curve is push the interest rate down to 6%. And so what the money supply going up will then do is the interest rate will drop. And so the quantity of money then increases by 75 billion. And what then will happen is, since the interest rate will decrease, investment will increase. To look at this a different way, with bonds and interest rate, the Fed sets the rate for bonds. So let's say you buy a bond for $1,000 and the interest rate is 5%. For each year you have the bond, this is $50 worth that gets paid off to you. So the interest rate, you get the interest rate every year. They pay you 5% every single year of this bond until it's up, and then they just give you your whole chunk of 1,000 back, as well as that 5% that you earned that final year. So if you have a 30-year bond, you get your $1,000 principal as well as 30 years worth of $50. So in this case, you would get, $1,500 on top of the bond. So not bad, right? You got twice as much money, over twice as much money in the end as you did at the beginning. And so what the Fed will do is, when they want to buy bonds, they will go to somebody and say that we want to cash out your bond. We will take your bond, which is worth $1,000 and has maybe like this many years left, and we're going to give you the chunk as well as this interest that you would have earned in the future years. So if the Fed decides they want to cash out the bond 5 years early, there's still 5 payments of $50 left, which means they have to give you $1,250 then. But that's how they would. So they buy the bond back to you, they put that money in your pocket, and they take that piece of paper back. If they want to sell bonds, what they would do is go to you and say, would you like a $1,000 30-year bond at 5% annual percentage rate interest? And then you would give them $1,000. That's $1,000 that is eliminated from the money supply. So bond prices and interest rates are inversely related in this case. So when the Fed buys bonds, and so when they're buying bonds, they're putting the money into the supply right there. That's expansionary. Bond prices become more expensive because there are now fewer bonds in existence. When there's fewer bonds in existence, they become more scarce, and people value them greater, so they will be willing to pay more money for them. But what also happens is, since they are putting more money into the money supply, since money supply goes up, we know interest rates go down. So these have opposite impacts, just like if the Fed sells bonds. If they want to have a contractionary monetary policy, bond prices would go down in this case, because now there's more bonds out there. More and more people are holding bonds. People don't feel that bonds are as valuable, or they don't value it as much. And so people aren't willing to spend as much for a bond. And so what happens is, to get people to purchase bonds, you also need your interest rates to go up. And so it's not just that the money supply impacts this, it also impacts that if they want people to buy or sell the bonds, they need to adjust the interest rates accordingly so that people still value the bonds. So they move around along with the value. If there's fewer bonds, they're valued more. The Fed realizes they can then charge a smaller interest rate and still get people to buy it. Even if it's at 3%, but you really want bonds, you will buy that bond at 3%. Everybody has a bond. It's like, well, I've already got some bonds. Why would I want to buy another? So they raise it up to 7%. And you say, all right, I guess I'll buy a bond. Hopefully that makes sense so far. Let me know if you have questions. But when these interest rates change, they change all interest rates. Notice that the federal funds rate is what banks are lending to each other. So when a bank borrows from another bank, this red line, the federal funds rate, that's how much they have to pay that other bank back. Then they turn around and lend that money to you if you are their best customer at the prime interest rate is the lowest that their best customer can get. So, teachers are probably somewhere up around, what I'm talking about. Teachers are, of course, all in the blue line, right? Economics teachers, perfect at all economics and know how to handle money. We hope. But that gap between what banks have to pay in interest to other banks and what we pay in interest to them, that's money banks make in profit. Because keep in mind, a bank doesn't run if they can't make money. And so to show once again how this has an impact, notice that the one on the right is a curve you've seen before. This is the investment demand curve. So notice that there's a direct relation. If we are at 8% interest rates in the money market and there's $1.5 trillion, the investment demand will be $20 billion. If our rate goes down to 6%, there is a supply of $175 billion in the money market, and the demand for investment is $25 billion. And so, notice that if it shifts up, if interest rates go up, there will be less demand for investment because people will not be willing to invest at such a high rate of interest. It's not worth it to borrow that at that high of a rate of interest unless you can make a lot of money from it. And so what these are called is these are transmission graphs. So this is very, very Keynesian, showing the impact on demand and supply. And so why these are transmission graphs is because the change in one goes on to the change in the next. So if we are operating at this equilibrium of 8% interest, at 8% interest, we have 150 billion in the money supply, we have 20 billion in investment, and we are at this point, let's say 82, in which our real GDP is QF. Now, if we decide to raise the interest rates, in this case, raise it up to 10%, now all of a sudden investment decreases. What impact does this have on aggregate demand? Aggregate demand will decrease because we have a decrease in investment. Remember, investment is a part of the whole calculation in GDP, CGI, and net exports. And when there's less investment, there's less GDP and less output in the economy. And so we would shift from QF perhaps all the way down to QI. And so all of these directly lead from one to the other. And notice investment does not just stop there. Investment moves on, it goes into people's pockets, they choose to spend some of it, they choose to save some of it, and it is then subject to the multiplier as well. But this is how it impacts aggregate demand when it works. And so, of course, with the Fed, though, they don't always care about how much money you have in their pocket. A good thing to remember is that the Fed cares about two things. This is their main goals are to have maximum employment, so create as many jobs as possible, but also have stable prices. And for them, they've kind of really gone more in the past that they care more about prices than anything. They love the price level. They care about the price level. They do not like inflation. Inflation is the terror of the Fed. And they are willing to do whatever they can to keep inflation down. They are willing to cause a recession just to stop inflation. And so while the Fed is very effective with this in the short run, it's kind of difficult with the impact on output. So while the Fed can impact price level, the Fed can really bring down inflation. They can bring up deflation. They can impact all that. What they are not very good at is unemployment. So they're not as good at controlling unemployment as they are at controlling inflation rate. And this is something called cyclical asymmetry. If you have questions on any of these, please let me know. I'd be happy to talk to you, and have a fantastic day.